Okay, let's unpack this. We've just come through a hurricane season with that really devastating storm, Helene, and now we're staring down the barrel of the 2025 season. Forecasters are saying it's likely to be above normal.
Yeah, and we've got this stack of material you sent over, articles, reports, some research, all looking back at Helene, but also trying to peer ahead, at the challenges coming up.
Exactly. It's a fascinating mix because it links the physical reality of these storms getting worse with all the complex human systems we rely on, forecasting, response, recovery, the whole thing.
Right. From meteorological data, deep dives to, well, even analyses of how disaster politics might play out.
Yeah.
It's quite the range.
And our goal here, for you listening, is to sort of cut through that stack, pull out the key insights. What are the real risks? What's actually going on with agencies like FEMA and NOAA? Can tech help? And yeah, how does politics even get into deciding who gets aid?
It's about getting you up to speed on what these sources are saying. So maybe we should start with Hurricane Helene, because one source, that AEM blog, really uses it as a wake-up call.
It does. It paints a brutal picture. Landfall as a major Category 4, winds hitting 140 miles per hour, record storm surge, just torrential rain, tornadoes, a 500-mile path of destruction. It's hard to grasp.
And the rainfall numbers in that source are just staggering.
Mm-hmm.
An estimated 42 trillion gallons of rain.
Wow.
To put that in perspective, they mentioned Lake Tahoe holds about 37 trillion gallons. So imagine just dumping more than Lake Tahoe's worth of water across the landscape.
Right.
That's what led to that catastrophic flooding.
And the cost. The AEM blog estimates the total damage and economic loss somewhere between $225 and $250 billion. That apparently makes it the costliest U.S. natural disaster mentioned across all these different sources we looked at.
But the human cost, that's the real tragedy, isn't it? That same blog reported at the time it was written over 200 deaths, hundreds more missing. It made it the deadliest hurricane since Katrina back in 2005.
Yeah, and the source noted about half those deaths were tragically in North Carolina. Just awful.
So Helene was definitely a wake-up call. And that AEM blog pulls out several key lessons from it. Lesson 1 seems pretty fundamental. Extreme storms aren't just happening. They seem to be getting more common and, frankly, more extreme.
Right. And this idea of rapid intensification storms powering up really quickly, that pops up elsewhere too, doesn't it? I think I saw it in the Dartmouth material, WGCU.
The UCS blog mentions it too. Helene did it. Hurricane Milton last year is another example they cite. It feels like it's happening more.
And the AEM blog clarifies it's not necessarily more hurricanes overall, but a bigger chunk of them are reaching that major status category 3, 4, 5.
And there's a climate link discussed.
Yeah.
Warmer atmosphere holds more moisture, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the source says that leads to these extreme rain events being, 1.3 times more frequent now than in the 1850s.
Yeah, and potentially 1.5 times more frequent by 2030. It's a significant jump.
There was one stat in that AEM blog that really stuck with me. It mentioned a storm hitting North Carolina just before Helene, massive rainfall, called a once-in-a-thousand-year storm.
Oh,
But here's the kicker. According to the source, it was the 5th such thousand-year storm that area had seen in just the last 25 years.
Wow, so much for once in 1,000 years. That really shows how the goalposts have moved.
Absolutely. Which leads right into lesson 2 from that blog.
Mm-hmm.
Extreme flooding is also becoming more common. Experts apparently think both the frequency and intensity will just keep increasing with warming temperatures.
Then there's lesson 4, which is less about the weather itself and more about, well, us, where we choose to live.
Right. The problem gets worse because more people are moving into these high-risk areas. Many of Helene's victims, the blog notes, were in floodplains. It cites a New York Times analysis showing population growth over the last couple of decades has been fastest in counties most vulnerable to floods, wildfires, hurricanes.
But then lesson 5 kind of complicates that picture. Maybe there's no truly safe place anymore.
Yeah, the whole climate haven idea. Asheville, North Carolina, for example, high in the mountains, far from the coast. Sounded safer, right?
You'd think so.
But the AEM blog points out Asheville was one of the hardest hit areas during Helene. Over 40 deaths reported just in Buncombe County, where Asheville is. Helene just reached so far inland with such intense rain, it showed vulnerability isn't always obvious.
So the risks are getting worse, and maybe spreading out in unexpected ways. Which brings us to the systems meant to protect us. Infrastructure, for instance. Lesson 3 from the AEM blog was pretty blunt about that.
Yeah, basically saying our flood and water infrastructure often just isn't up to the task anymore. It mentioned worries about dams overflowing or even failing during Helene, though thankfully none did catastrophically.
And the bigger picture issue is age, isn't it? A lot of U.S. infrastructure is old. That AEM survey found water infrastructure is, on average, 7 years past its designed lifespan.
And think about a design decades ago for the weather risks of that time, not for the kind of extreme events we're seeing now. It just wasn't built for it.
Which makes it more vulnerable. Okay, then lesson 6 hits another big one. Insurance. Or rather, the lack of it for floods.
Huge gap there. Look at Helene again, based on that AEM blog. $250 billion in losses, but maybe only $10 to $17 billion insured.
That's massive. Most standard homeowner policies cover wind damage, maybe rain getting in, but specifically not floodwaters rising from outside, right?
Exactly. And here's a statistic from that source that's pretty shocking. In those hardest-hit North Carolina counties, like Buncombe, less than 1% of homeowners actually had flood insurance.
Less than 1%. Wow.
And this ties into the National Flood Insurance Program, the NFIP. It's supposed to make sure people in designated high-risk zones get flood insurance, especially if they have a federally backed mortgage, but it relies on FEMA's flood maps.
And those maps, they're a problem, according to the AEM blog. Because floods are getting more frequent and intense, the maps get outdated faster than they can be updated.
Plus, they tend to focus on river and coastal flooding, not necessarily the kind of widespread flooding from extreme rainfall like Helene caused. A 2017 Homeland Security study mentioned in the source apparently found 58% of FEMA flood maps were inaccurate or out of date.
58%, that's more than half.
Yeah. And another analysis from 2020, also mentioned, found fewer than 60% of properties that should be considered high risk were actually designated that way on the maps.
So people might not even know they're at high risk.
Exactly. FEMA itself apparently acknowledges that over 40% of flood insurance claims come from outside those official high-risk zones. So lots of people are vulnerable, potentially uninsured, and might not even realize the full extent of their risk based on the official maps.
Okay, so increasing risks, aging infrastructure, big insurance gaps. It really raises the question of federal preparedness, doesn't it? What about the agencies we rely on, like NOAA for forecasts and FEMA for response?
Well, this is where several other sources raise some significant concerns. PBS NewsHour, Dartmouth, WGCU, UBNet, the UCS blog, they all report issues around staffing and funding, particularly referencing actions reportedly taken during the Trump administration.
What kind of issues?
Well, the PBS NewsHour piece, for instance, reported significant staffing cuts at both NOAA and FEMA. It questioned whether they had the capacity to handle forecasting, tracking, cleanup, recovery effectively.
I remember reading that. It also mentioned FEMA staff were reportedly under restrictions, like limiting travel or speaking engagements, which could hurt community training and coordination.
Exactly. That PBS report even cited reported comments from Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem suggesting plans to shrink or even eliminate FEMA, shifting more responsibility onto states.
Which state officials were worried about, right? Whether they could handle it.
Understandably, yeah. The report mentioned turmoil, executives leaving, morale issues, general confusion at FEMA during that period.
And NOAA, too.
The Dartmouth source reported NOAA lost hundreds of employees, something like 900 people or 7% of its staff, reportedly due to cuts implemented by Elon Musk's Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE, as part of a push to cut federal spending.
Right, DOGE. And Dartmouth also mentioned proposed budget cuts, like 25% for NOAA overall, and potentially eliminating funding for its research arm.
Yes, the UCS blog echoed this, adding that FEMA had reportedly lost about 2,000 full-time staff, a third of their workforce becoming more reliant on reservists. UBNet and UCS called it an assault on these agencies, pointing to draft budgets that seemed to double down on cuts.
And beyond staffing and budget, some sources mention disaster aid itself being affected.
UBNet and UCS reported instances where the administration reportedly denied or delayed disaster assistance requests from several states. California, Tennessee, Virginia, Washington, Wisconsin were apparently denied aid, while others faced delays or partial denials.
Okay, so those are the reported issues. What do these sources say could be the impact of all this on, actually forecasting storms and responding effectively?
The potential consequences described are pretty concerning. Dartmouth and WGCU, for example, worry about disrupting the data flow that forecasts rely on stuff from ocean buoys, tracking temperatures, data from weather balloons, crucial inputs.
And if that data stream is disrupted?
Well, Dartmouth raised the specter of reduced accuracy in predicting hurricane strength and landfall. Their example was stark. Maybe forecasters predict a Cat 3, but missing data means they miss its rapid intensification into a Cat 5 until it's too late. That puts lives at risk.
Yeah, absolutely. Timely warnings are everything.
They also worried about timely data for those crucial shorter-term forecasts needed for evacuation decisions. And Ubinet and UCS pointed out that NOAA's research labs are where they refine the hurricane prediction models. Cuts there could degrade our forecasting ability over time.
Dartmouth even mentioned a specific potential cut, the Hurricane Research Division possibly shutting down, which could make the data gathered by hurricane hunter planes less effective.
That was mentioned as a risk if proposed cuts went through, yeah. And then there's the coordination piece. PBS NewsHour reported worries that those FEMA staff restrictions could hinder communication between federal, state, and local emergency managers.
Which you definitely don't want during a disaster.
No. And the UCS blog basically worried that a reduced capacity at FEMA just creates more risk and harm for communities trying to recover. WGCU also noted some NOAA databases being retired, like that billion-dollar disasters tracker, which arguably makes it harder to see the long-term trend of costly climate impacts.
It does paint a challenging picture for federal readiness, but
Okay.
the WGCU source brought up an interesting angle. Technology, specifically AI. Could AI maybe help fill some of these gaps?
It definitely explores that possibility. The idea is that AI, being able to process vast amounts of data quickly, could potentially help, especially if resources are tight.
What kind of examples did they give?
Well, Google DeepMind's GenCast model was mentioned. It learns from historical weather data and apparently showed some real promise predicting Hurricane Milton's track well in advance using existing NOAA and European data. Though the source notes it's not great at predicting intensity yet.
Okay, what else?
The Internet of Things concept. Imagine pulling data from countless private sources during a storm, security cameras, maybe even phone location data anonymously, and using AI to give emergency managers a real-time picture of damage, road blockages where people are evacuating.
That could be powerful.
And there was a tool from the University of Florida called Beacon. It uses AI to quickly translate official emergency alerts into multiple languages using natural-sounding voices for radio or apps. Tested during Milton, apparently. Crucially, it relies on trusted and reliable government sources for the initial information.
And something about inland flooding, like with Helene.
Yeah, SloodMap, an Australian tool using AI to predict how inland floods might behave and analyze vulnerabilities. Exactly the kind of thing that could have been useful.
So AI sounds promising, but were there caveats, downsides?
Oh yeah, definitely. The source included perspectives from experts cautioning against seeing AI as a silver bullet. W. Craig Fugate, the former FEMA director, was quoted saying AI can help, but only if the basic data collection stays strong, the radar, the planes, the buoys.
The very things other sources said might be under pressure from cuts.
Exactly. He seemed less certain that NOAA could keep delivering the high-quality data needed if budgets are squeezed. He sees AI more as a decision support tool.
Makes sense. Any other warnings?
Amy McGovern, from an AI institute, stressed that AI is only as good as its data. You need reliable, verified data, preferably from non-commercial sources. She worried about AI hype leading to models being oversold, meaning people might put too much faith in an AI prediction that hasn't been fully vetted or is based on incomplete data, and that could actually lead to dangerous decisions.
So potential help from AI, but heavily dependent on getting good data, which might be a challenge. It's complicated.
It really is. Which brings us to another layer of complexity, the politics of disaster aid. We have that academic article from PMC that looks at federal aid after the 2017 hurricanes.
Right, comparing Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico with Harvey in Texas and Irma in Florida. What did that study find?
Well, the findings, as reported by the study's authors, are pretty stark. They found that despite Puerto Rico having comparable needs and experiencing what the authors called unprecedented mortality, they used the phrase deaths of thousands of Americans. Puerto Rico got substantially less aid, and it was delayed compared to Texas and Florida.
Less aid and slower aid, despite similar or worse impact.
That's what the study reports. They also looked at who participated in the congressional debates about the aid packages. For Texas and Florida, they found bipartisan participation, Democrats and Republicans involved.
And for Puerto Rico?
Overwhelmingly Democrats, according to the study. Republicans participated significantly less, over 30% less, in the debates about Puerto Rico aid compared to the debates about Texas and Florida aid. Democrats, meanwhile, participated more than twice as often as Republicans in the Puerto Rico aid discussions.
That's a big difference in participation. Did they look at what was said too?
Yes, a qualitative analysis of the rhetoric. They reported that for Texas and Florida, Republicans made substantive arguments about the citizens' needs and deservingness. For Puerto Rico, however, the study found Republican statements were often brief, sometimes just thoughts and prayers, lacking those detailed narratives justifying aid or strongly affirming the citizenship and needs of Puerto Rican Americans.
And the study reported finding something about mortality rates.
This was perhaps the most challenging finding they reported. Mortality rates in Puerto Rico were negatively related to Republican participation and the substance of their debate contributions about Puerto Rico aid.
Meaning higher death tolls didn't lead to more engagement from that side in the debates.
According to the authors, it suggests the death toll in Puerto Rico appeared largely irrelevant to how congressional Republicans, as reflected in these debates, mobilized or framed the discussion around aid for the island.
So why the difference? What explanations did the study authors offer?
They argue politics, not just geography or storm severity, is likely a key factor. They discuss potential influences like racial resentment or perceiving Puerto Ricans as an outgroup, though they note that's hard to measure directly in debates and might show up as coded language or just omission.
Or partisanship, party strategy.
Exactly. They introduce this concept of disaster gerrymandering.
Okay, what's that?
The idea, as they explain it, is that political attention during disasters is driven by things like partisanship and trying to win votes, focusing on loyal voters or maybe potential swing voters. This can lead to competition between states for resources and might disadvantage areas that are seen as less politically valuable.
And did they find evidence of that in the 2017 debates?
They reported that participation was related to electoral interests, like whether members represented districts hit by disasters or areas with large Puerto Rican populations on the mainland who could be swing voters, particularly in places like Florida.
Interesting. So mainland Puerto Rican voters might have influenced the debate?
That's what the study suggests was a factor, yeah. They also pointed out Puerto Rico's unique challenges being a territory, no voting members in Congress, its colonial history, all creating barriers and reducing electoral incentives for politicians to prioritize the island's specific concerns.
So the authors basically concluded.
They concluded their findings aligned with this disaster gerrymandering idea, suggesting Puerto Rico was effectively treated as an outgroup compared to Texas and Florida, and how Republican aid prioritization occurred in these specific debates, both quantitatively and qualitatively. And they suggest this dynamic might apply to other low-income states, territories, or areas with large minority populations if they're perceived similarly by congressional members.
Okay, so just to be clear, that's the analysis and conclusion from that specific academic study.
Absolutely. We're reporting on their findings and their interpretation of those findings.
Right. So pulling this all together, it's quite a complex picture, isn't it? We're heading into a potentially rough hurricane season, knowing from storms like Helene just how bad things can get, and aware of these underlying issues with infrastructure and insurance.
And at the same time, we have these multiple sources reporting concerns about the capacity and funding of the key federal agencies, NOAA and FEMA, tasked with forecasting and response.
Then there's the potential promise of AI, but it seems heavily reliant on data collection that might itself be under strain.
And finally, that academic analysis raises questions about how political factors, maybe even electoral calculations or group perceptions, have influenced disaster aid distribution in the past.
It really leaves you thinking, doesn't it? Given the storms are getting stronger, our systems have these vulnerabilities, the agencies face reported challenges, and politics clearly plays a role. What does that mean for our ability, really, at all levels, federal, state, local, even individual, to prepare for and recover from the next big one?
Yeah, and how do we ensure that the response is effective and also equitable when the storms themselves don't follow political maps or care about voting blocks? It's a huge question.
It really is. A lot to chew on there. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us today.